Well, looks like the prediction we made last week about the SEC having some problems and big concerns, and concerns that they haven't had in a long time. They are weaker than they have ever been. At least that's what I think, and I was proven right over the weekend. We made this kind of crazy projection that it might be that at the end of the season, Georgia has not played a single top 25 opponent. And it's looking like after this past week, that might be the case. If we look at Georgia's upcoming schedule here, they've beaten Ball State, they've beaten University of Tennessee Martin, or is that Texas Martin? I don't know, UT Martin, South Carolina. Actually a close game. I mean, if you're a Georgia fan, that was not pretty there for a long time. Now, eventually you pulled it together in the end. And kind of dominated in that second half, but you were down 14-3 at half. Come back, big win. Defense started to take over and really cause some problems for South Carolina. Spencer Rattler really just did not have time to throw, ended up throwing 2 interceptions. So, kind of took the game over eventually, but your opponents later in this year are not looking too great. Obviously, UAB, no. Auburn, not ranked. Kentucky, not ranked. Vanderbilt, not ranked. Florida. Now, Florida is just hanging on, right, at 25. But we said maybe no top 25 opponents. And if you look, Florida already has a loss. If Florida loses a couple more times or has some struggles, they're not going to be in the top 25. And the same is true with Tennessee, who just dropped 12 spaces after losing. And who did they lose to? Florida. That's not great, right? They're going to beat each other. They're not very good. They're all these kind of mediocre teams that there's going to be some losses there. So Tennessee drops 12 spots to 23. Florida's at 25. They're on that edge, that very precipice of falling out of the top 25. So really, if you're Georgia, your only hope at this point is you got to hope Mississippi doesn't lose to Alabama this weekend. Mississippi loses to Alabama, they'll probably drop. Mississippi loses again. If you look at the Ole Miss schedule here, right, they've got Alabama, then they got LSU. Depending on what you think of those teams, they might drop both of those games. They got to still play Texas A&M. They still got the rivalry against Mississippi State. They still got the game against Georgia. It's very possible that they will lose multiple of these games and fall out of the top 25. And the same is true with the other teams on Georgia's schedule. Florida. South Carolina seems like they're okay. They still got to play LSU. Missouri, probably okay there. But then they're going to have a rivalry game against Florida State. Very possible they pick up a couple more losses here. I don't think they'll lose to Charlotte. Kentucky has given them trouble in the past. South Carolina seems to be at least competent, and we don't think Florida's very good. I mean, if South Carolina can be leading Georgia at half, what's to say they can't beat Florida? And they still have to play Florida State. So there's 2, 3, 4 more losses. And that's if Georgia's winning these games, right? What's unfortunate is for Georgia to have a top 25 opponent, they might have to lose, right? And that's going to knock them out because the only top 25 team they played, they're going to have lost to. So if you're Georgia, you cannot lose a game, and you really probably cannot lose the SEC title game. And this is a problem for a lot of the teams in the SEC. Typically, in a normal season in the past few years, the SEC has dominated the number of teams in the top 25, and that's helped bolster, I think, the rankings of those teams come the end of the season. You'll have a 2 or 3 loss team in an Ole Miss that gets ranked because, well, their only loss is to Georgia and Alabama, and they've beaten a couple other ranked SEC teams, and they all just kind of stay ranked because they beat each other. They never play anybody outside of the conference, or maybe they do, or one of the teams does and is very dominant, like a Georgia or an Alabama. And then all of a sudden, they're all ranked at the end of the year because their only losses are to other ranked SEC teams. But the problem is this season, the other conferences are much better than they have been recently, and it's causing the SEC to drop out, especially the side Georgia is on. You could definitely make an argument that Texas is in a similar boat, although they have the out-of-conference win against Alabama. And that's going to help them. That is going to help them at the end of the year. If we're looking at teams here at the top 4 and it starts to get close because you maybe, let's say USC runs the table. Let's say Notre Dame runs the table. Okay? USC is undefeated. Notre Dame undefeated. Florida State undefeated. Michigan, I mean, when we start getting down to it, Georgia, you cannot lose your SEC title game. And you need to hope that there are going to be some other conference champions, or at least you need to hope that there are not 5 undefeated teams at the end of the year. Because if there are, let's say, in a realistic way, it could very well be Georgia undefeated, Michigan undefeated, Texas undefeated, Florida State undefeated, USC undefeated, and Notre Dame undefeated. That is actually possible, right? Typically in a year, it's hard for that to happen because certain teams will all play each other. So if you are a Georgia fan, here is what you are rooting for, and this is what you need to happen to make sure you can get into the playoff. First, you have to win all your games. If you drop a game, Georgia, you're probably out. Just because your strength of schedule is not going to be able to compete. Unless absolute chaos happens other places. And you end up with like a 3-loss Big Ten champion or something like that. You got to win out to give yourself a shot, I think. I think if you lose a game, especially if that game is the SEC championship, but because you don't have any quality opponents on your schedule, any of those losses are going to look bad. If you lose to Florida, who lost to Utah without Cam Rising, you're in trouble, right? If you lose to Ole Miss after they got smoked by Alabama, these are not good losses. You don't want to lose to Tennessee. If Tennessee beats you, you're in trouble. So you need to win out your games. That's goal number 1. That has to happen. Then I think you actually need some help to get into the playoff. As crazy as that sounds, because you're ranked number 1 in the country right now. But towards the end of the season, all these other teams are going to have big wins, potentially. So what you need to be rooting for, if you are a Georgia fan, you are a huge Texas and a huge Florida State fan. Why are you that? Because Texas beat Alabama and Florida State beat LSU. And one of those 2 teams is going to be probably your opponent in the SEC championship game. And so you need that win, which might be your only top 25 opponent, to look even better, right? And they do that by Florida State just rolling everybody. Texas rolling everybody. Oh, okay. Yeah, Alabama and LSU aren't maybe that top tier, top 4 teams, obviously, but that's why we have a playoff, for them all to play against each other. But Georgia also handled Alabama and or LSU, depending on who they play, right? So you need Texas and Florida State, and you need them to roll so that the loss for an Alabama team and an LSU team doesn't look so bad. Along those same lines, you're a bit of an LSU and Alabama fan for right now. You want one of them to really separate, to really demonstrate that they are, in fact, the better team. And you need them to be ranked, top 15, hopefully. Right? And at the moment, Alabama and LSU are both top 15. Now, they will play each other. So you're hoping the winner of that game doesn't have any other losses. They're a fairly highly ranked team coming in. And then you need to beat them in the SEC title game. So that's 3 of the 4 slots taken. And this is where it gets dangerous. If you are Georgia, I think you need a 2-loss Big Ten or Pac-12 champion. Michigan or Ohio State probably out of the Big Ten, although Penn State could make a push. You need whatever the champion is of those teams, they need to have 2 losses. I don't think it'll probably happen in the Big Ten just because of the scheduling. I don't know if there's enough games for there to be a 2-loss champion, right? do they play each other enough? And that might be hard to ask for because there really is a huge separation right now in the Big Ten. Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State look to be very good. And after that, Iowa, maybe? But there's really only those three teams. So the Big Ten really is in a weaker perspective, I think, than even the SEC from a conference perspective. Georgia just happens to have a terribly weak schedule this season. So Big Ten, I don't think you're going to get a 2-loss Big Ten champion. There's not enough games or teams that can beat each other. So your hope is the Pac-12 champion is going to have 2 losses, which is possible because the Pac-12 is loaded this season. But here is the problem for Georgia. Let's say they are the undefeated SEC champion. If there is an undefeated Pac-12 champion and an undefeated Big Ten champion, say Michigan runs the table, you're not getting in over those. It's going to go to those tiebreakers, right? We have multiple conference champions, multiple undefeated conference champions. Georgia is in serious trouble should the Big Ten or the Pac-12 produce one. I think they might even be in trouble if it is a 1-loss team, particularly if it's a Michigan, Ohio State. Let's say Ohio State loses. If Michigan has 1 loss, maybe they lose to Ohio State, but then beat them. I don't know. It's going to be really, really hard to keep those teams out. The other thing, you cannot have an undefeated Notre Dame team at the end of the year if you're Georgia. If that happens, you're going to be dealing with and making an argument of, okay, so Texas and Florida State, you've been rooting for them. They went out. Yay. Good for them. If Notre Dame is undefeated at the end of the year, with their strength of schedule, they're going to get in. It would be very hard for them not to get in unless Ohio State completely implodes after this week and they, Notre Dame beats them and then Ohio State falls off a cliff, loses to Purdue or something. I don't know. It has a bunch of losses. But if Notre Dame is undefeated, if you look at Notre Dame's schedule, they will have beaten Ohio State. They will have beaten Duke. They will have beaten USC. They will have beaten Clemson. And Louisville, Pitt, and Wake Forest are not necessarily pushovers by any means. NC State might get ranked towards the end of the season. We don't know yet. If Notre Dame beats USC and Ohio State, who at this point look like both of those will probably play in their own conference championship games, Notre Dame will have beaten 2 of them. Georgia ain't getting in above that. So if Notre Dame is undefeated at the end of the year, and Texas and Florida State are undefeated like you're hoping and praying they are, now you're going to be in an argument with maybe a 1-loss Michigan or a 1-loss Ohio State. Most people would say Michigan looks significantly better, at least on paper, than Ohio State. They will have to play the game. And Michigan's in a similar scenario to Georgia in that they do not have that difficult of a schedule. If you take a look at it, first 4 games, no problems. Don't see them having any problems with Nebraska or Minnesota. Indiana, Michigan State is tanking right now. Purdue's not great. Penn State, Ohio State. If Michigan wins both of those games, I don't see any real problems here on the schedule. And if that happens, if Notre Dame is undefeated, Michigan is undefeated, Texas and Florida State are undefeated. If that happens, because remember, rooting for Florida State and Texas to have multiple losses is not necessarily in your best interest in Georgia because it's going to discredit the one win that you're going to have against either LSU or Alabama should you win the SEC title game. So you really want those 2 teams to stay undefeated. So if you're Georgia, I think this week you have to watch that Notre Dame-Ohio State game. And you got to pray that Ohio State wins that game. Because even a 1-loss Notre Dame team could get tricky. There's some 1-loss teams out here that could pose a serious threat to Georgia. A one-loss Pac-12 champion. With how loaded that conference is and how many big wins they're going to have on their schedule, a one-loss Pac-12 champion versus a no-loss SEC champion, that's going to be a barroom discussion for the ages, especially if an Alabama or an LSU drops another game. Alabama loses to Ole Miss. Ole Miss loses a couple of games. If that side of the SEC kind of beats each other up, and you're sitting at your one ranked win is maybe the SEC championship game against a SEC team not even in the top 10 or the top 15, because it's a 2 or 3 loss team after you beat them in the SEC championship game. Alabama already has 1 loss. That's going to be a 2-loss Alabama team. They lose to Mississippi. Now they're a 3-loss. So now you got to hope Mississippi's really good. Mississippi drops a game or two. LSU drops a... There's a very real possibility you have 1 win against a top 25 team at the end of the year. And that team is not even ranked in the top 15. You compare that against, let's say, USC is a 1-loss Pac-12 champion. Let's even make the argument that Notre Dame beats USC. Okay? Notre Dame beats USC. And that's USC's 1 loss. So they didn't drop a single game against anybody in the Pac-12. They're going to have 4, maybe 5 top 25 wins on the year. And their 1 loss was an out-of-conference game, which I think teams should get some credit for, against a Notre Dame team that if they beat all of those teams, they're in. Georgia ain't getting in. You're now arguing, okay, am I good enough? No, you're not. So, a lot of scenarios, it is still early in the season, but I do think there is serious concern if you are a Georgia fan. I think you do need help. I think you need some chaos in the other conferences. I think you need Notre Dame to not be undefeated and a 2-loss conference champion out of the Big Ten or the Pac-12. Because I think a 1 loss might get in above you. Depends on the team, depends on how they lose. But it's going to be tricky because you didn't play anyone. This is something that I'm hoping for next season with the expansion of the playoff. We can kind of get past this in that a Georgia team would be able to get in. They're a conference champion, ranked conference champion. You're in. We don't have to worry about that. We don't have to have this argument about, oh, what if USA wins the Pac-12? Only losses to Notre Dame. Notre Dame goes undefeated. Texas, Florida State go undefeated, and Georgia goes undefeated. That's 6 teams that would have a real argument for 4 spots. So be on alert, Georgia fans. You might be in trouble, and it might turn into one of the craziest arguments at the end of this season. This season is shaping up to be wild. So if you're Georgia, I think you're in the most trouble. I think the rest of these teams up here are pretty much win out and you're in, right? Florida State, you win out. I think you're in. Texas, win out. I think you're in. Both of them have big out-of-conference wins against SEC opponents. Michigan, you win out. I think you're in. USC, win out. You're in. Because you will have knocked off Notre Dame. And I think an undefeated USC team is going to get the bump over an undefeated Georgia team. Notre Dame, you win out. I think you're in because you will have beaten USC and Ohio State. And Clemson. Should Clemson turn the season around a little bit? And Duke, who's currently ranked. All of those teams, I think, have an opportunity. Win out, you're in. Same with Penn State. Same with Ohio State. Same with Washington. Washington might need a little help just because the problem of Notre Dame, if both of them went out, it would get a little close. As far as who gets in that situation, if there's a lot of undefeated teams at the end of the year, which typically there are not. This is college football. There are upsets all the time. Florida State could lose to Clemson this weekend. They're not a huge favorite. Could happen. So there is opportunities, but Georgia, you need some help. Georgia, I think, is the only top 10 team that if they win out, are not guaranteed a spot. They'll need somebody else to lose. Could happen this weekend. Ohio State beat Notre Dame. Georgia, you're going to feel a lot better about yourself. We'll see what happens. It's going to be an exciting weekend of football. What a slate of games this weekend, by the way. Let me know which game you're most interested in watching down below. What do you think about my theory? Could an undefeated Georgia team not make the playoffs? What would that be like on the internet? Holy smokes, I can't imagine. I cannot wait to see how the games go this weekend. I cannot wait to see how this season shakes up. If you're excited like me, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of the videos we post here daily, and we'll see you tomorrow.